Um, Hello, everyone, and welcome to this roundtable on algorithmic transparency and the public sector. My name is Zimeta. I'm Head of Public Policy at the Open Data Institute, and I'm chairing the session. With me today are Fionntán O'Donnell, Senior Data Technologist at the ODI, Natalia Domagala, Head of Data Ethics at Cabinet Office, Neil Chue Hong, Director of the Software Sustainability Institute at University of Edinburgh, and Tracey Brown, Director of Sense About Science. So thank you very much for making it today. So the way that we'll be running this roundtable is we're going to use the chat panel to collate comments, questions, and feedbacks from the audience, from the participants, and we at the ODI are going to share this with the speakers afterwards. So please keep your comments coming. I won't be reading them aloud, but we'll be collecting them. If you'd like any of your comments or feedback or questions to be anonymous, just mark that when you submit it, and we'll anonymize it before we share it. And at the end of this session, we'll be posting in chat a sort of PDF of resources related to what the speakers have been talking about and the topic overall, so we can stay in touch and keep it a dialogue. Great, so with that housekeeping over, let's begin the discussion. So what is algorithmic transparency? Well, there are different definitions and different interpretations of it. So I'm going to offer a few just to demonstrate the range. So it could be transparency about which algorithms are in use and when they are in use. It could be transparency about how the algorithms are working, the actual sort of analysis itself. Or it could be transparency about the outcomes of an algorithmic calculation. Transparency is important for trust. It's important for accountability, and it's important for quality assurance. So in this session, we'll be looking at that whole spectrum of algorithmic transparency and different approaches for developing it, with perspectives ranging from citizen engagement to software development. But what is distinctive about the public sector? So the trust in the institutions that use algorithms for key decision-making, it's really critical when the institutions are powerful ones, which is what government is. So algorithmic decision-making in the public sector has the potential to do a lot of good, but potentially a lot of harm. And that's why it's so important to get it right either way. And in this morning's keynote, John Whittingdale, the Minister for Data, mentioned that the UK National Data Strategy is out for consultation, and one of the areas in it is exactly this topic. So this roundtable is a great opportunity to improve and define good practice in this area. So with that background in place, I'm going to turn to Fionntán. So Fionntán, please can you tell us a bit more about open data and open models and what they could contribute here?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mike. So yeah, during the summer we were researching data sharing, particularly around COVID, and one kind of branch of that research stream was looking into the sharing of the epidemiology models around it. We all hear talk of like the models, and the models say this, and this is what we should do. And so it's actually big in the news, but models have been used by algorithms have been used by, I mean, you could even say possibly hundreds of years. It's kind of but it's part of a larger theme of work we've been looking into across multiple projects around the opening and sharing of models. And so, like, probably first off, ask like, what is a computer model? There's a lot of kind of maybe misinterpretation around, like, when people say algorithm, what actually do they mean? But a computer model, in this sense, is just a representation or a simplification of a part of the world, written as code or software. You prod it, poke it, put data in, see what data comes out, and you hope this model helps explain, forecast, predict something about the world, and help you know how to act. So examples of this, obviously the COVID ones, but people are using weather forecasts, people use modeling for traffic. You can model parts of the economy, what's going to happen. But so I'll give five reasons why they should be shared and open, right? So one, so others can find errors and improvements, kind of the best disinfectant is light argument. If you open it up, people have opinions. They can say, well, how it should be changed for that purpose. So two, how can they be, the second reason is they can be adapted and reused for other things. People might use parts of the code, people use parts of the tools, techniques, data. If you open it up, then it can be taken and used for other purposes. Third reason, increases trust. So this is within organizations as well as outside of them. So if decisions are informed by models, and it's just, if decisions are informed by models, then, so say like a data scientist says, oh, we should do X, Y, Z in the next quarter because the model says this, or a model kind of implies this, then how do people trust that if they can't access it, if it's not documented, if it's not shared around the organization, and also outside the organization as well? Say for customers of a company, they know what's actually happened or how they are being modeled, you can say. And then fourth is more kind of specific on that and increasing trust, and it's around democratic accountability, and this obviously specifically about governments. You don't really want people, especially in the case of the COVID modeling, COVID epidemiology modeling, to say, oh, it's these shadowy figures sitting in some darkened room making decisions about us. But if people in government can go, no, this is the evidence we have, this is the tools we use, this is the techniques we have, we don't have anything to hide here. And you can kind of let others look into that and explain that and get that out to the wider public. And which links to the last reason, which is better communication. So if you open it up, then people can not just adapt the actual model or tool or code itself, but people can adapt the explanation. You might document it in some way, but then others will, particularly say the media, will be able to explain that further on to other people. I'll quickly just wrap up by saying another list, 4 steps we have to opening and sharing models. 1, be documented, create documentation that explains it to your intended audience. 2, publish it. That could be on your website, could be on GitHub, could be a shared model directory within your organization. 3, openly license it. And then lastly, tell people about it. Find the communities, people that would be interested in it, link to it, and blog about it. And that's probably my spiel on open models, really.
Fionntán, that's excellent. Thank you. I have a quick follow-up question, if I may. So you're talking about people adapting, the technology and adapting the models. Which people are you talking about? Which people do you have in mind for this?
Well, I mean, particularly, I guess, like the same reasons you have open code, open software. I mean, it can be particularly research. So people in a similar area will take that. Like, so my background is AI and machine learning, and it's extremely common that, say, big companies will train models, say, for image recognition. They might train it to recognize, certain people, animals, things, or whatever. But that can be taken and adapted and reused by other organizations for their particular purpose. So usually it's for practitioners in the same area or it could be a completely different area. It's not really. It's just that by opening up, it allows kind of other people to expand and adapt on that. And that was kind of a big part of, there was a big, massive government report on computational modeling, if you're into that kind of thing, which I am, big content 20-page report. And I said that kind of, it helps build skills across the country, really, across the multiple sectors as well, by kind of increasing this knowledge by opening and sharing them.
Thanks. That's really interesting, the capacity building point. That's a really interesting outcome. Thank you. So at this point, I'd like to turn to Neil and bring him in. So Neil, you're also in the technology space. Please, can you tell us a bit more about open software and how that might make, or what might that might contribute to sharing?
Thanks, Millie, and thanks, Fionntán, for really introducing the subject and meaning I don't have to do quite as much work in here. So at the Software Sustainability Institute, we work with researchers in academia and industry to understand how to improve things like reproducibility and reusability of software. So it's all about how does different pieces of software help build the fundamentals of research. And that obviously leads into a lot of systems in the public sector around policy and around how infrastructure is organized. And I think one of the things that we've noticed is that openness and transparency are intrinsically linked to reproducibility and reusability. And in the open source community, for instance, and open source here is where the source code, the underlying programs that are used to implement the different algorithms are published and are made available to other people to inspect and to reuse. So open source software naturally lends itself to this kind of transparency. However, the challenges are that whilst it's easy to share, and it is relatively easy in terms of the legal perspective to come up with good licenses and good governance models to allow you to share software, that's not the whole story. So I think software is just the first step. And I like to talk about it in terms of both the barriers to the people who are developing the software and also the barriers to understanding the software and making it understandable to the general public. There was some surveys done by Victoria Stodden in the US across a wide variety of different areas, looking at the reasons why people don't share their code more openly and trying to work out why basically people were less open and less transparent around this kind of software that's used in public policy and so on. And the main thing that she identified was that people were afraid that by sharing their code and making it more open, it would make more work for them. And the reason for this is because as soon as you start sharing your code, counterintuitively, the problem is you have to explain your code. And that's, I think, one of the main barriers to transparency when it comes to the software part of algorithmic transparency. Software isn't necessarily easy to understand by everyone, and a lot of people think you just get the algorithm nicely set out in the piece of software, easy to understand, easy to see where the data is coming from, easy to understand how the decisions around optimization, engineering, and structuring of the implementation are taken. But ultimately, two things happen. The first is that we try and make things more efficient, and that can slightly reduce the readability of software. And also, we are often up against deadlines. I'm particularly thinking in this pandemic of all of the poor modelers who have been working 24/7, trying to make sure that they are updating the models for pandemic spread, for vaccine research, even for things just how you schedule hospitals. So I think the big thing here is that there are barriers to sharing your code, which people don't often think about. And I think if we're to look at it from the other side, one of the things we need to be able to do is be more welcoming of people who are sharing their software in an attempt to improve transparency. I was disappointed earlier this year, as Fionntán said, when Neil Ferguson's group, for one, shared their modeling code in the interests of making things more transparent. And then they were attacked on multiple sides, both from people that you would perhaps expect to be looking to discredit the models, but also from people within the software engineering community who perhaps don't understand the challenges in developing these models and making sure that you can support them. So I think the key thing, just to wrap up, is that how you use and explain software's outputs is as important for transparency as the openness of the software itself. The software can help, and publishing the software definitely can help. But if we're to better educate and better understand the different ways in which an algorithm is implemented, we need to have ways of allowing us as the more general public to be able to play with these algorithms and understand the ramifications of changing data and changing decisions. So I think one of the things in the last 10 or so years that has been really good is the increasing use of information visualization and what are called computational notebooks. So they're interfaces, often through websites, that allow other people to basically see how an algorithm works by playing around with the data and playing around with the parameters. And if we do this right, what we can do is ensure that publishing software doesn't lead to just a whole set of requests for further information, but that people can understand how to use it and how those decisions are being made.
Thank you, Neil. That's really interesting, and I hope we get a chance to return to that with a follow-up question, because I think that idea about the kind of the openness overhead, the cost of sharing, the cost of kind of trying to make this work open, is something that's not always kind of considered or understood. That's fantastic. Thank you. So I'd like to bring in Tracey at this point, and because we've had a couple of mentions now of the importance of public understanding of what's going on, and that's exactly what you do at Sense About Science. And in the last year or so, you've done some really excellent work on kind of data science and the public understanding of that. And that will be shared with the audience members afterwards. But I wanted to ask you for now, let's say we get the technology right, and it's, the code is open, the model is open. What else is needed to implement algorithmic decision-making in society, particularly in the public sector?
Well, Millie, thank you so much for having me on. This is such a delicious conversation. There's so many things I want to pick up and eat. The first thing I would say is it's worth acknowledging that we can talk about models in society as a result of the COVID pandemic, and people don't think that we're talking about a fashion shoot or a new car. So, I mean, I could talk about it with my mum, and she kind of gets what I'm talking about, which is amazing. So we're in this kind of situation where they have come sort of front and center of us talking about how decisions are made and how we estimate the future, and whether we can base it on the past. I had a great discussion about, whether we can use flu to predict COVID and all that stuff. So I think there we are. It's a tall order, and it's things that a lot of us struggling to get across. It is really, really important that we equip society now to have a critical, and I mean critically evaluative discussion about the applications of data science to problems and decision making. We are nowhere near ready enough to ask those questions. In fact, I would say that it really makes me think of medicine in the 1960s, where, a few people really knew what they were doing, and the rest of us felt too dumb to ask. And, it has taken us 50 years to get to the informed patient. And here we are once again in this field, repeating the same thing, which is that we are not thinking about how do we equip people to be part of the conversation as it pertains to decision making. So to take your question, Millie, the thing is here is everything can be good. I'm glad to see the word quality like cropping up every other question in the chat box. And quality is so important. We need to know about whether there have been tests, we've used test data, and whether things have, how things have performed. But most importantly, context is everything, because we are seeing increasingly applications taken out of one context and sold into another one. And I mean sold, local authorities and regional authorities, district bodies, and so on, depending on which jurisdiction you're in, are buying products that purport to take over decision making for them, and yet we can't seem to peel back the layers. So I'm struck by a lot of what Neil was saying. I love a lot of what Neil was saying, but I think we're in a kind of prior place, which is that you have a situation where people's the decision about whether people can access social benefits, social security, for example, whether they can access assistance with their rent in difficult circumstances, is now been turned over to something that purports to spot whether or not they could be fraudulent. When that person asks no longer the decision maker, but the vehicle, that person, the person in the authority has become the vehicle to relay the decision from the output of the software. And they ask them, how is that decision fair? That person doesn't know how to answer that question either. And at what point in the commissioning are these questions being asked? And are we confident? I would not be able to turn over a new rail station to a rail network provider if I couldn't show the entirety of the commissioning, the quality checks that were made along the way. In fact, the commissioning handover process would take longer than the construction of the station. Right, just to kind of understand in other fields how much that quality control dominates. The approval of, usually the approval of a new vaccine takes just as long as certainly as the first stage of getting to stage 1 trials, right? So in other fields, it is the longer process. What we see is solutions being sucked through into new contexts really fast here. And where is the questioning process, and how is the society, whether it's politicians, journalists, members of the public, how are we equipped to ask those questions that we need to be asking?
I think that's brilliant, and your point about the fact that there is this public kind of awareness of the notion of models now in a way that there wasn't a year ago, but also the importance of context is really crucial. That's brilliant, thank you. So Natalia, I'd like to bring you in now, because this is exactly the important context, right? Public and government. I wonder if you could say a bit about what you're doing about this in Cabinet Office, particularly because of the National Data Strategy at this point.
Great, thank you very much, Millie. So as you've all basically just said now, the idea of transparency and openness is actually nothing new in the UK. And this proactive transparency in the use of algorithms that we're aiming towards will be an organic extension of the work that we've been doing up to date, so of our existing open data and data ethics work. And I think that having such strong foundations, like in the case of the UK, should really be helpful in building meaningful algorithmic transparency tools. And to us, transparency means that your actions, processes, and data are made open to inspection by publishing this information in a completely open, understandable, easily accessible, and free format. And we do have this long-standing work of the open data movement, and we've got the open by default policy introduced in 2012 for public sector data across all departments. And this approach supports the benefits of open data release for a number of desired outcomes. So that's accountability, efficiency, and economic outcomes. And then we have the data ethics work with the data ethics framework that really emphasizes the importance of transparency of algorithmic models. So the policy foundations for algorithmic transparency are very much here already, and they have been for a while, well, almost 10 years. And what we're doing now, so we're building on this when scoping and developing algorithmic transparency measures. So we are currently analyzing the lessons learned from this open data movement and from various data ethics projects. We're looking at all those fantastic initiatives that have been done with open data on the local level, on the national level, and we are drawing conclusions that will help inform our algorithmic transparency work. And looking at that already indicates that if we successfully implement proactive algorithmic transparency measures, the benefits will. And we're looking at various open government initiatives as well, because, basically what Tracey has just said, we need to go beyond transparency. We need to incorporate participation and accountability considerations from the very, very beginning to ensure that this transparency is meaningful. And that we are able to actually have an open conversation with the public, and that we can increase their understanding of the use of AI in the public sector, their understanding of algorithms overall, and benefit from this work done throughout COVID, really, with public awareness of the use of AI and data. But the benefits of algorithmic transparency in government go beyond accountability or efficiency. They also include encouraging responsible innovation, enabling data scientists to launch more ambitious AI and data projects, because they will know that any potential unintended consequences will be mitigated early on. And the public will also have an opportunity to gain a better understanding of how the algorithm is used. They can also interact with the system straight away. And currently we've got the tools such as the data ethics framework, we've got the guide to using AI in the public sector, we've got other guidance on gov.uk to support the most ethical, the most transparent, the most safe use of algorithms in the public sector. And building on this existing work on algorithmic and data ethics, as well as transparency and openness, we've committed to exploring the development of an appropriate and effective mechanism to deliver transparency on the use of algorithms, facilitating decision-making within the public sector. So we've got this commitment in the National Data Strategy that was published in September. The strategy is now open for public consultation until the 2nd of December. And I would really strongly encourage everyone to send the recommendations. And we've been looking at various reports and recommendations already. So we've looked at the work done by a number of stakeholders, the ODI, CDI, Alan Turing Institute, Ada Lovelace Institute, AI Now, and various academic institutions as well. But at this point, we would very much encourage others to submit their consultation responses as well, because this is a really new emerging area. And governments around the world are, as they're entering this new phase of AI adoption, there needs to be a lot of emphasis on enhancing transparency, building capacity to assess algorithmic systems, and also understanding how we can engage the public, what kind of organizational and legislative mechanisms are there to support reporting of algorithmic decision making, and how can we ensure that this transparency is meaningful? How can we ensure that the public really know how to interact with what we publish and that they can hold us accountable? And I think we're almost out of time, so I'll probably stop now.
No, thank you. And it's really interesting. I hope we have time for one more round of questions where I can pick up on your points about the international comparisons. And I can see some really fantastic questions and comments in the chat panel. I'd say to the audience, please keep them coming, because we're going to share them with the speakers for follow-up and for follow-on engagement. So we have a bit less than 5 minutes left. So I'm going to give each speaker one follow-up question, and you're going to have 1 minute to answer. So prepare yourselves. So Fionntán, there's been a lot of talk about how the pandemic has kind of raised public understanding of, kind of algorithms, but also the importance of how they're used. So my question to you, to be answered in 1 minute, what have been your experiences of open data and/or open models in the pandemic response? 1 minute.
I'll go for less. With the variety in the way they're published, some use open source communities, some use visualizations, some just use the research paper. What there needs to be, I think, is more standards around that, around the good publishing. What is a well-published model? Those questions, and kind of communities in different parts of science coming together to agree on those standards. So I think that would be the main promotion. Better standards around model publishing, I would say, is what's needed.
Thank you. So Neil, I'm going to give you one final question, and again, 1 minute to answer. So what role could open software play in the public sector, and how could this be balanced against other considerations such as national security and the privacy of individuals?
Thanks, Millie. I think that open software has a very large role to play in the public sector. As people pointed in the chat, there are a number of governments who have adopted policies putting open software at the forefront. The other question is really interesting. I don't think in general openness and transparency of software are orthogonal to security and privacy of data, but I do think that we have a challenge, particularly around some forms of algorithms. A lot of people will talk about AI and particularly deep learning, and there are very real problems with bias that we need to address. And I think I was really glad to hear what Tracey was saying, because I think the key challenge is understanding that the assurance process, the sign-off process, is the thing that takes the time. The software development's almost the easy part of all of this. So the question is really, how do we make sure that that time is given and that we aren't rushed towards putting out things without having gone through those quality checks?
Thank you. Tracey, so we've heard from the panel that, transparency and openness are not, and there might not always be a common understanding of what they are or what they might entail or what might be involved. So my question to you is, how do we set public and policy expectations about standards of transparency, standards of clarity, and standards?
Yeah, so I think it's great to be amongst people who are thinking that there's an awful lot more to do here than dump stuff in the public domain. They're a much more sophisticated understanding of what transparency actually means. Thank goodness. I think we have to find ways in for people. So we have three basic questions. It's where did it come from? What are the assumptions being made, and what's the weight you want to put on it, which is another way of sort of leading everybody into the discussion about context. So where did it come from? We can talk about the quality of the data, we can talk about the limitations, etc. We can talk about biases. What are the assumptions that are being made? I think it's fairly self-evident. And what weight do you want to put on it? I mean, that's a huge important point from a policy point of view. But I think those are less scary questions. Otherwise, every time you raise the question of applications of data science, you get kind of a policy knee-jerk towards privacy, because that's a terrain that policymakers feel really comfortable on. They feel like they can understand their public remit there. But as guardians of quality and quality assurance and commissioning, they find it a much harder place to be. So I think what we need to think about is, for journalists, for policymakers, and for anyone else, actually helping them to work a way in, that they're not going to become experts in this area. So let them actually just unleash the questions and to know what to look for, even if they aren't in a position to mathematically be in the debate. I think that's the crucial thing. Is it's not for fear of their lack of deep knowledge. Let's actually get let's get the right questions being asked, and that's our challenge at the moment.
Excellent, thank you. And I hope we've been asking the right questions today at the summit. So Natalia, final word to you. So this is a work in progress for Cabinet Office. What are you looking at when you're analysing the existing public sector algorithmic transparency models from around the world? Final minute.
We're looking at 5 different aspects. So firstly, we're looking at the formats and technical specifications. So what kind of models are out there already? Are they part of a wider system? Are they isolated transparency models? Then we look at accessibility to non-expert audiences and whether there are any follow-up activities or feedback loops built into the model. We're also looking at enforcement mechanisms and wider organizational structure and legacy within which the models function. And finally, accountability mechanisms to ensure that there are clear accountability structures in place and that the citizens can use this information in a meaningful way.
Thank you. And it's so important and exciting that we have a chance to contribute now. So before I close this panel, I'd like to point out that we're about a resource, a PDF resource, so that audience members can follow up with the speakers about our work in this area, as well as kind of information on how to stay in touch with us to continue the conversation. So thank you very much for all the questions and comments that have been placed in chat. We're going to download these and share them with our speakers for follow-on discussion, unless you've requested that they be anonymous, in which case we'll remove those identifying details and just communicate the gist of them. So I want to say thank you very much to the panel. That was a really fantastic session. I wish it could have been much longer. I'd like to encourage everyone to move from here to the coffee lounge, to network with the speakers and with each other, continue the conversations that you've been having in chat online, in person. I want to say in person, but what we have to do is close this room and go to another one, so press a couple of buttons on your screen. But please join us there in a couple of minutes, and we'd love to continue the conversation. Thank you, and thank you to the panel.
Thank you, bye.
So I think let's head over to the coffee lounge. I think I'll stay here.